Hi, I'm Bronwyn Williams, and we're back with our Flux 15-minute foreplay conversations. Alongside me is my colleague Tumelo, and today our guest is Tim Stark from scenarioDNA. And Tim, I wanted to ask you a bit about your way of making sense of the chaos in the world, your patented model for looking at the stories and sentiments around us and trying to make some sense out of it.
Well, it's a wonderful question, and it's great to be here. I would say that our method is something that has evolved over the last 20 years in response to models that were falling short in understanding the complexity in which how society was changing. The models that we had or demographics and psychographics. And when we came into developing this patent, what we were looking at especially was how many companies and organizations were misunderstanding this new cohort, which were millennials. They were very interested in you know, uh, the potential of that cohort generation, but they were missing the complexity of the relationship between smaller and larger signals. They were allowing their bias to get in to how they read what would happen next. So our model in culture mapping doesn't look at sort of statistics or answers, asked and answers, kind of approaching polling, typical kinds of demographic modeling. It's more looking at the words and the relationship between language, between explicit and implicit meaning, to understand how that language is telling us how society is changing and different parts of society are changing before it's completely obvious. So, one of the main things when we were doing that development of the patent, it was we were looking at the relationship between millennials and their attitudes towards privacy. This is at the birth of social media. Every company would say linearly that the growth of social media would continue, it would grow, everybody would accept this. We were saying, no, there's a pattern to that. There's a language to that. Understanding that less known area, I think, is really, it's why many companies are moving over to really recognizing the value of foresight. And our model is a living foresight model. So it allows us to be able to take this linguistic data, pattern it, map it, put it in the context of these social groups, these subcultures that make up this whole piece of culture that we call culture, and be able to ask really, really tough questions about more complex questions of sustainability, privacy, all these other kinds of more ambiguous kinds of questions, I should say.
Could you give us like an example? Because I mean, for this is very, I mean, I'm new to this. So an example of how you would go about, like you said, using language to map cultures and sentiments and so on.
Well, one of the things is that you need to always be recognizing and studying all of these different subcultures. For any particular topic, I mean, the obvious example is that our model is very much a power system. So essentially, language eventually becomes the law. It becomes the rule. It becomes the way in which we sort of regulate ourselves as a whole society. But the assumption is that that's how all of society is functioning. It's not. The descent of that society, that language are, you start seeing it in protest movements. And it's not even just in obvious kind of people who are out on the street protesting. It's people who start making things differently. I mean, one of the simple examples is, we see these things much more clearly when big events happen like recessions or pandemics. Etsy emerged during the recession. I mean, Etsy is a business, but that kind of code of relationship between consumerism, that DIY kind of like local, you start seeing codes of behavior were being affirmed with a lot of other things that were changing. We were, the other externalities like people moving to cities, becoming more collective minded. But you need to be able to understand this living foresight model of language to be able to say, like, how is it all changing? Otherwise, if we looked at it demographically, we'd say, well, people in cities believe this and people who don't believe in cities believe that. That's really not what it is. It's a mix of these things, and they have particular taxonomies and codes, and we can ask better questions. I think that something about the process is not about answers so much as being in foresight is about being able to ask better questions, to be able to sort of probe more deeply, because we're trying to move past our existing bias of what we think is going to happen. I always just want to sort of touch quickly on that point is that I think until recently, we've missed sort of the difference between what is uncertainty and ambiguity. And I think it gets to this issue, and the pandemic really helped us, is that we talk about being in uncertain times. And I would argue we're not in uncertain times, we're in ambiguous times. Being, blind spots to the future are not unknowns completely. They're just that we're not looking in the right places. And so our model is very much about helping companies and organizations look to where they're not looking, but also bring evidence to that process.
Can you just explain that difference between, especially for our viewers, between ambiguity versus uncertainty? So like how would you define the difference between the two?
Well, if you look at it from a dictionary definition, the uncertainty is really, and it tends to sort of be associated with anxiety. And it's like, well, I can't know that. And a company would say, well, these are uncertain. Well, so we'll just stop doing that. Ambiguity is actually that you don't have all the information. And actually, the other definition of ambiguity is that there could be two answers or multiple answers to the same question. So when you start speaking of blind spots, it's that, a company might say, well, we can't know that. I would argue that you're not looking in the right place because the answer that you have is this other place. But and in the case of very specifically within organizations, they tend to look internally with what their company does or their competitors. Then it's like, well, then what does their category do? And then even beyond that, they're saying, what are we doing in the relationship to society? Every company through the pandemic was forced to rethink issues of localization. We see trends in nearshoring and reshoring of manufacture and so forth. These are big topics, but they relate to understanding changes of the relationship between consumers and organizations, and the value chain that have to do with who they're getting their information from. Like we're social creatures and we're trying to how do I understand what I think I'm going to value? What would be something if we move a culture to being on demand, for example, on demand manufacture, it doesn't just happen. It has to be coalesced amongst groups of people. I would argue that there are groups of people who understand those codes of behavior now. We're just not paying attention to them. And so it's bringing in that social data earlier, being able to answer those tough questions and invest better in terms of the future that we want.
Is there a classification for the social data? So like these blind spots, are there like different kinds of blind spots now? Because now you're talking about, when you say ambiguity, it's like basically it's like a bit of a haze, you don't see clearly. There's certain areas with a bit of a fog, So is there like a classification? Are there degrees?
Yes.
Like really is that from blind to foggy to blurry to
yes, definitely.
stars,
You're touching upon exactly what our model does, which is it's a semiotic model of developing 4 story spaces, which is residual, which is where sort of the order of society is; dominant space, which is where many trend people look, which is things that are being shared, and we're beginning to change our behavior, but it's very obvious, it's still on the surface. These are sort of the above the fray. They're kind of like clearer to see. Underneath that surface is an emergent space where there are new techniques that are being contextualized. In the case of fashion, it's like we're moving towards being net zero and lossless manufacturing. But I can't understand that from a consumer dominant space. I need to understand that from a designer space. Like, what's the purpose of making? And then in the disruptive space, it's that space that's going, you're doing it all wrong. We need to completely rethink the system. And so all those play a role. And I would argue that when you're working with an organization, it's not working in any of these spaces, it's working in all of these spaces and trying to enable a company to move into the disruptive space earlier, because every company needs to make those 20, 30, 40-year out investments now, but it's difficult because they don't see how it's going to actually change. But when you start seeing your market as a living foresight model, you can start saying, well, if I make those investments, I see how it's going to affect those behaviors. I see that it's tied to these social groups in that particular way. So it's a way of modeling in that way. It's something that was developed, that we all methodologies build on other methodologies. It's built on a semiotic methodology called RDE, residual, dominant, emergent. And what we did is we added an extra space, which is disruptive. But then we're using a social science method. We're using computational linguistics. We're using Bayesian modeling. There's a way, you can measure language, and you can, if you can understand that social groups have distinctions and they have they're trying to tell you something that isn't working. Our world is a biological system. It isn't random. We're trying to work through things. It's, are we paying attention enough? And that's really sort of what I would say. We make that case when we're speaking to our clients. It's like, you want to be better connected, you want to be ahead. That's the point. Pay attention to those signals earlier.
So then how do you get better connected then, right? Like, so how do you, like I say, like, how do you go from like slightly dazed and confused to like clear, crystal, like, vision, like, I don't know if I'm making sense, like from driving in
Yes.
a foggy place and then it's all clear and
Yeah.
birds are chirping and the sun is shining and it's great.
It comes down to having an evidence-based model. I mean, this is a social science model. There are approaches to trend analysis that are purely, they believe. It's sort of scanning and kind of going, I believe this is going to happen. But you have to base it on, I can show you the groups, I can show you the language that's developing that particular narrative, because trends are narratives, they're stories, right? We understand our world through narrative. And so if we're going to analyze trends, we have to say, well, there's stories, and then stories are made up with language. So there's taxonomies to those stories. And then there isn't just one story, there are different stories and there are patterns to them. When I mentioned that difference between uncertainty and ambiguity, I would point you to, something called the Rashomon effect, which is from the film Rashomon, which is there's, many people are telling the same thing that's happening as we're going through this experience. Understanding the patterns between those narratives is going to give you a better picture of what's happening as a whole. It's a collective intelligence as opposed to one, a company intelligence or a government's intelligence. You have to understand something as a whole.
So then how do you then, I'm going to say as an individual, after you just told me it's a collective intelligence, then how do you as an individual then, because I feel like it's it's very counterintuitive. It goes against the way we think and see things, because it's normally the things that are like prominent or dominant and residual that we actually focus on. We rarely get to the, like under that surface, that area. How do we nudge ourselves towards that? Like, what are certain practices that you would advise someone like me walking down the street, looking at not uncertainty, ambiguity, and say, these are the things that you have to keep in mind. This is how you would frame a question for you to be able to get deeper, to explore under the surface, to actually be able to have more clarity.
I would say that, the obvious case to make, which is in trend analysis, is that the failure of sort of our kind of little history of kind of modern trend analysis has been like chasing signals and then sort of bringing them in and copying them. And then wondering why they don't work so well, is that because of the nature of technology and media, our society is changing so much more rapidly. It's becoming more subversive. It's harder to see things as they actually are. So when you see something, Brat Summer that's been happening here in the US, it sort of is misinterpreted as being something that is is a trajectory, when in fact it's a response to something else, and it's actually a signal to something else that's going to be proceeding. So the point would be is that when you find these signals, you don't go, oh, I found it, I have the information. Is you say, I know what that's related to, and I can imagine, I can do analysis to show, I can see how that language is going to continue to evolve, and I could say, I know who is going to contribute to the evolution of that story. I can map those subcultures and I can understand how they're dealing, and if the context changed. For example, I'm basing it on what I know now, but for example, what if we dip into an entrenched recession that wasn't predicted? Though I'm going to still be able to model that from a social science perspective to say those externalities within how the language was changing now gives me an updated hypothesis. If you were doing it in the last way, in sort of the typical traditional way, you would have been like, oh, well, that's not popular anymore. Let's go find what else is. And it's going to take you quite some time to be able to see how people are kind of expressing sort of a obvious way in which they're processing things that are changing under the surface. I would say that we're becoming so much more stealthy as a society. If you talk to people, and I know that all of you talk to youth quite a bit and you understand this, they are not signaling in obvious ways. And so part of it's being able to decode so many different layers of signification that's going on. They are all semioticians. They're all kind of like this generation has become sort of natural semioticians because they were raised in a highly technological media centered society. They understand how media works in that way. So I would say recognize how to grasp those signals at that moment and know it gives you that confidence of what you know you can do next and the other sort of investigation you can go on from there.
Well, I could ask you so many questions, especially about this specific topic. But I mean, it's a 15-minute conversation. But thank you so much for your insight, especially around and I like the issue about the signal. And I think you've noticed me nodding about how we normally spot the signal and we want to drag it and make it like internalize it, bring it to our company. And I guess it's the nature of the world we live in now. It's interconnected. It's got media all everywhere. So I mean, there's suggestions. You're not really sure what you're seeing, and if what you're seeing is really what you are interpreting it as it is. So I think this model really helps get underneath the surface to ask the kind of questions like, is this really a trend or is this really a signal? What does it mean? What is it related to? What came before? What came after it? What are the subcultures or subgroups that actually link to it? So it makes us flesh it out more deeper. But I think also this approach helps us see blind spots. And also define what the kind of blind spots we actually see. Like, is this like I'm completely blind, I'm deaf, blind, I can't see, I can't do anything? Or is it just like a haze, or is it just a few sparkles and I can still see a bit of the picture? Thank you so much for like unpacking this. And I know it's a very limited amount of time to just get into this model and approach. But for those who are watching, please continue to subscribe, check previous videos, look at other models. This is just adding on to a body of work that we're doing. Share with your friends, share with your networks, read up more on the stuff so that you can also be able to spot signals, use foresight in a way that's actually beneficial, not only for you, but for your organizations. Thank you so much, Tim, for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you.